The lights of the courtroom seemed harsher that day, glaring down like spotlights on a stage where history was about to be written. Outside, the hum of cameras and the shuffle of reporters created an electric tension. Headlines pulsed across every screen, bold letters screaming, "Crockett versus Vance." Social media boiled over. Hashtags erupted, timelines exploded, and suddenly every political junkie, every casual observer, every disillusioned voter was glued to the same unfolding drama. No one expected a freshman congresswoman to take on a sitting U.S. senator. No one believed a first-term lawmaker would dare to challenge a man anointed by the MAGA machine as one of its future kings. But when Jasmine Crockett filed her lawsuit against J.D. Vance, MAGA's walls shook with the force of an earthquake. It was a shockwave that rattled not just Washington, but every small-town coffee shop, every college campus, every diner where politics still stirs arguments over breakfast. The sheer audacity of it sent jaws dropping. Here was a young black woman from Texas, a lawyer by training and a fighter by nature, putting her name on the line against a man who styled himself as untouchable. For MAGA loyalists, it felt like betrayal from the establishment they thought they controlled. For progressives, it was a rallying cry, a moment that said courage can still cut through corruption. Cameras zoomed in on Crockett as she emerged from the courthouse steps. Expression steady, voice calm, but unshakable. Reporters shouted over one another, desperate for a soundbite, desperate to capture the nerve it took to go toe-to-toe with one of Trump's chosen heirs. Inside the GOP echo chamber, whispers turned to panic. If this lawsuit gained traction, if this story spread, the veneer of invincibility around J.D. Vance might fracture, and with it, the illusion of MAGA's permanence. And yet, behind the flashbulbs and frenzied headlines, something deeper was unfolding. This wasn't just paperwork filed in a federal court. This wasn't just another partisan feud destined to vanish in the next cycle of outrage. What Crockett had set in motion was a collision of values, a test of character that cut to the marrow of America's democracy. Because this was not just about a lawsuit, it was about the soul of American politics. To understand why Crockett's lawsuit mattered, you have to step back and look at the figure she targeted. J.D. Vance wasn't just another senator. To the MAGA movement, he was supposed to be the heir apparent, the man groomed to carry Trumpism into a new era, polished enough to appeal to the suburbs yet ruthless enough to satisfy the base. He branded himself as the voice of real America, the champion of small towns forgotten by elites. But behind the slogans was a rhetoric that had grown increasingly toxic, a steady drumbeat of division that pitted neighbor against neighbor and stoked fear like kindling. Vance had learned the MAGA playbook well: speak with conviction, twist grievances into fuel, and repeat the lie until it sounds like truth. He knew how to turn complex issues into simple enemies: immigrants, progressives, journalists, anyone who dared to question the movement. To his supporters, it made him sound like a fighter. To his critics, it made him sound like a man weaponizing distortion to secure power. In that divide, America's democracy found itself more fragile by the day. That is why Crockett's lawsuit hit like a lightning strike. It wasn't just about statutes or claims buried in legal filings. It was about calling out a system of manipulation that had gone unchecked for too long. Her decision forced the nation to stare directly at a question it had been avoiding. Will we allow distortion to pass for leadership? Or will we demand accountability even from those who sit on gilded pedestals of political power? For MAGA, the lawsuit was an outrage. How dare a freshman congresswoman challenge one of their chosen? For progressives, it was vindication. At last, someone was not only speaking truth to power, but dragging that power into the arena where lies meet evidence, the courtroom. For ordinary Americans, caught in the middle, it was impossible to ignore. Was this really about Crockett versus Vance, or was this about America itself caught between dignity and distortion? The stakes could not have been higher. If Crockett won, it would not just wound J.D. Vance's reputation. It would pierce the myth of MAGA invulnerability. If she lost, it would be spun as proof that the movement's champions were untouchable, that truth simply could not break through the fortress of distortion. Either way, the impact would ripple far beyond one case, and in that sense, the lawsuit became something bigger than Crockett or Vance. It became a moral referendum. Every headline, every viral clip, every hashtag was really about America's soul. Do we believe in facts or in falsehoods? Do we side with accountability or with arrogance? Are we still capable of demanding honesty from those who govern us? Crockett, standing calmly at those courthouse steps, represented the quiet dignity of truth. Vance, with his carefully sharpened rhetoric, embodied the seductive power of distortion. The collision was inevitable, and the outcome promised to reshape the battlefield of American politics. Viewers could feel it in their bones. This was no ordinary fight. It was the kind of clash that forces people to pick a side, to decide what kind of country they want to live in. And yet, the deeper we look at Vance's story, the more contradictions unravel. Before he became a MAGA firebrand, J.D. Vance wore a very different mask. He rose to fame not as a political warrior, but as a storyteller. His memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, painted him as a chronicler of forgotten America, a man who had walked through the fires of poverty and addiction in Appalachia and emerged with insights about resilience and survival. The book was hailed as a window into a culture elites had ignored. Overnight, Vance became a darling of the media, a thoughtful reformer who spoke the language of empathy. Back then, he was critical of Donald Trump. He called him dangerous and compared his rhetoric to the lies of demagogues. He presented himself as the antidote to division, someone who could bridge the gap between rural America and the coastal elite. For a time, his brand was authenticity, someone who could criticize both sides while staying rooted in the values of his upbringing. But ambition has a way of twisting even the most earnest beginnings. As the Trump era reshaped the Republican Party, Vance's careful balance began to look more like isolation. He was celebrated by intellectual circles, but ignored by the populist base that increasingly controlled the GOP. His dream of political power dangled just out of reach, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to shift. First came the silences, moments when Trump crossed a line and Vance said nothing. Then came the hedging, carefully worded interviews where his old criticisms were replaced by excuses, by context, by caveats. Finally came the full embrace. By the time Vance launched his Senate campaign, he wasn't just supporting Trump. He was recasting himself as one of his fiercest defenders. The man who once warned of authoritarianism was suddenly parroting the very lines he had once condemned. It was a transformation that seemed less like growth and more like surrender. And in that surrender, a new version of J.D. Vance emerged, polished, calculating, ruthless. He had mastered the cadence of MAGA rhetoric, painting himself as a warrior for real Americans while sneering at those who dared to question him. He embraced grievance politics like a weapon, wielding it to divide rather than unite. What made it more jarring was the hypocrisy. Here was a man who had built his name on warning the nation about the dangers of lies and demagoguery, now standing as the poster child for both. He once claimed the country needed leaders who could rise above hate. Now he trafficked in it shamelessly. He once said dignity mattered. Now he mocked opponents with smirks and sound bites designed to inflame rather than inform. And yet, Vance carried himself with the arrogance of someone convinced his transformation was invisible. He thought his supporters would never read his old quotes, never revisit the moments when he called Trump reprehensible. He believed the MAGA base would forget, because he had become their loudest cheerleader. He calculated that as long as he gave them the rage they craved, the past would vanish into silence. But ambition leaves fingerprints, and Vance's are everywhere. His shift from reformer to firebrand is not just a story of political evolution, it's a case study in the slow corruption of ambition. Step by step, compromise by compromise, he abandoned the authenticity that once made him unique, and in its place he built something colder, harder, more dangerous. A man willing to distort his own truth to secure power. It is in this context that Crockett's lawsuit lands with such force. Because when you strip away the campaign slogans and the fiery speeches, what you see in Vance is not strength, but fragility, a man propped up by distortion, terrified of anyone who dares to challenge him with facts. His rise is a warning of what happens when ambition devours principle. His image is polished, but the foundation beneath it is cracked. For those watching from the outside, the hypocrisy is infuriating. For those who believed in him once, it feels like betrayal. And for those who see him now as MAGA's heir apparent, the danger is clear. A man who has already proven he will say anything, twist anything, become anything in the pursuit of power. He has cast himself as the villain in this story without even realizing it, because every villain believes they are the hero. J.D. Vance's tragedy is not that he changed, it's that he believes no one will remember who he used to be. But Crockett's own story makes this showdown even more explosive. Jasmine Crockett's path into the halls of power did not begin with privilege or inherited influence. It began with grit, the kind forged in the quiet corners of America where people work 2 jobs just to pay the bills, where justice too often feels like a luxury reserved for the powerful. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett learned early what it meant to fight for dignity in a world quick to dismiss women who looked like her, spoke like her, and carried themselves with a defiant kind of pride. She found her calling in the law, not as a stepping stone to wealth or status, but as a weapon to defend those who could not defend themselves. In courtrooms across Texas, Crockett stood as an advocate for the voiceless, taking on cases others avoided, fighting for those caught in the machinery of systemic injustice. She was young, black, and unapologetically direct. Judges sometimes bristled at her sharpness. Opposing attorneys underestimated her until they felt the sting of her cross-examination. Clients loved her for one reason above all. She told the truth, even when it was hard to hear. But Crockett's courage did not come without scars. She had faced moments of loss, setbacks in her cases, and the sneers of colleagues who doubted her. She knew the feeling of being dismissed before she even spoke. Her competence questioned simply because of her gender and her skin. Those wounds might have silenced someone else. Instead, they became the steel in her spine. Every time she walked into a courtroom, every time she faced a panel of skeptics, she carried the weight of those doubts and turned them into fuel. Her entry into politics was not scripted by party bosses or donors in back rooms. It was born from necessity. Communities she served were under siege, from voter suppression to economic exploitation, from underfunded schools to over-policed neighborhoods. Crockett's neighbors urged her to step up, to take the fight from the courtroom to the legislature. She resisted at first. She had never dreamed of being a politician, but eventually she realized the truth. The system could not be fixed case by case. It needed champions willing to shake its foundations. As a state representative and later as a congresswoman, Crockett brought that same fire. She was not polished in the way establishment figures expected. She was blunt. She called things what they were. When opponents tried to corner her, she hit back with precision and force. Cameras captured her in moments of raw authenticity, eyes blazing as she cut through excuses, voice steady as she demanded accountability. These clips spread online, making her a rising figure not because of staged speeches, but because of the rare power of honesty. Critics called her too sharp, too confrontational, too unwilling to play the game. But for those who had grown tired of politicians who smiled while betraying their promises, Crockett was refreshing. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't trying to be anything other than herself. A woman who believed justice should not be negotiable. That dignity was not a partisan issue, and that truth mattered more than political convenience. Her flaws made her human. She could be stubborn, impatient with the slow grind of bureaucracy, unwilling to sugarcoat her words for fragile egos. But it was precisely that authenticity that made her magnetic. In her presence, people felt the difference between someone who seeks power for its own sake and someone who carries it like a burden on behalf of others. Crockett was not perfect, but she was real. Her rise was not meteoric, but it was undeniable. She became a symbol of resilience for women of color who had long been told to wait their turn. She became a rallying point for progressives who feared the soul of democracy was slipping away. And above all, she became a reminder that courage doesn't always look like compromise. Sometimes it looks like standing firm when the room demands silence. When she filed her lawsuit against J.D. Vance, it wasn't a stunt. It wasn't political theater. It was the culmination of everything she had lived and fought for, a refusal to let distortion stand unchallenged, a refusal to let arrogance bully truth into submission. She knew the risks. She knew the odds. But she also knew that silence was not an option. To her supporters, Crockett embodied the hero archetype, flawed but resilient, scarred but unbroken, a woman who carried not just her own story, but the stories of countless others who had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. She was their voice, their fighter, their champion, and when these two worlds collided, sparks flew that would ignite the nation. The clash did not remain confined to court filings or legal documents. It spilled into the public square, igniting a storm of words and images that would grip the nation. Crockett and Vance became locked in a duel that played out on cable news panels, social media feeds, and even the hushed corridors of the Senate. It was no longer just a lawsuit. It was a spectacle, a battle of willpower and words that drew millions into its orbit. Vance struck first, with the dismissive arrogance that had become his trademark. On the Senate floor, he mocked the lawsuit as frivolous, a desperate attempt by a backbencher seeking attention. On television, he smirked as he called Crockett radical, painting her as part of a progressive fringe disconnected from real Americans. The condescension dripped from his words. He spoke not as a man defending his record, but as one who believed his opponent was too small to even matter. But Crockett was not one to shrink under condescension. Her rebuttals landed like sharp blades, cutting through his sneers with precision. On one network, she countered, "If holding a sitting senator accountable for distortion is radical, then maybe America needs a little more radical honesty." In another interview, she reminded the public of Vance's own words, resurrecting his past criticisms of Trump that directly contradicted his current devotion. "What changed?" she asked. "Not the facts, not the truth. Only his ambition." The back and forth became addictive for viewers. Clips went viral. Headlines framed it as a David and Goliath showdown, except this time David wasn't armed with a slingshot, but with truth sharpened into arguments. Twitter threads dissected their every move. TikToks remixed their exchanges into memes that spread like wildfire. In one, Vance's smirk was slowed down and overlaid with Crockett's fiery quote, "Ambition doesn't erase hypocrisy." It racked up millions of views overnight. The media poured gasoline on the fire. Night after night, panels debated who was winning the war of words. Some hosts marveled at Crockett's fearlessness, calling her the future of progressive politics. Others rallied to Vance, insisting he was under attack by woke radicals, but even among conservatives, cracks appeared. Quietly, some admitted that Crockett had struck a nerve, that her relentless precision made Vance look rattled in ways his base was not used to seeing. Meanwhile, in Washington's back halls, senators and staff whispered. They watched Vance grow sharper, more defensive, his tone laced with irritation that betrayed unease. Crockett, by contrast, grew more composed with each round. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was its own weapon, making his sneers look smaller, his outbursts more desperate. In the theater of politics, demeanor is everything, and Crockett was winning that battle. For progressives, her performance was vindication. Here was someone unafraid to take the hits, unafraid to call out hypocrisy in real time, unafraid to stand tall even when the odds tilted against her. For Vance's supporters, the confrontation was a rallying cry, proof their man was being targeted because of his influence. But for the millions in the middle, those who had grown weary of both sides, this battle forced a harder question: who looked more like a leader? The tension only escalated. Every statement was scrutinized, every soundbite dissected. Each exchange raised the stakes higher, drawing more eyes to a confrontation that no one could turn away from. Crockett versus Vance had become more than a lawsuit, more than a debate. It was a test of who held the moral high ground in an age of distortion. And just when it seemed the battle lines were clearly drawn, something happened that neither side could have predicted. A moment that froze the cameras, hushed the pundits, and left even MAGA loyalists without words. But then came the moment that silenced even MAGA loyalists. The moment arrived not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap. For weeks, the feud between Jasmine Crockett and J.D. Vance had simmered in the public sphere. Arguments volleyed on television, exchanges dissected across social media, tension mounting with every headline. But when Crockett officially filed her lawsuit, it was not just a new chapter. It was a mic drop that reverberated through every corner of American politics. The courthouse steps gleamed under the midday sun. Reporters jostled for position, cameras clicked furiously, and social media live streams captured every angle. Then came the bombshell. Crockett's legal filing wasn't vague, wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. Pointed allegations laid bare a pattern of distortion, defamation, and reckless rhetoric that she argued had crossed the line from politics into personal and professional harm. This wasn't a stunt. It was a full-blown legal offensive. Inside the filing, the allegations were laid out with cinematic pacing, each accusation cutting deeper than the last. Exhibit after exhibit highlighted Vance's statements, tweets, speeches, interviews, juxtaposed against documented facts. One section meticulously contrasted his words on immigration with his earlier academic writings, exposing not just hypocrisy, but willful deception. Another laid out instances where his comments, Crockett argued, weren't just partisan jabs, but defamatory attacks meant to delegitimize her very character. The precision of it all stunned the press. This wasn't a scattershot attempt. It was a scalpel taken to Vance's political persona. The lawsuit read like a screenplay of accountability where every line tightened the noose. And at the center of it stood Crockett, calm, composed, almost serene in her delivery. The contrast with Vance and his allies could not have been starker. MAGA surrogates scrambled for talking points. Conservative pundits tried to dismiss it as a witch hunt, but their voices cracked with urgency. Behind the scenes, aides rushed to craft statements, fearing that the evidence laid out so clearly could stick. The bravado that had once defined Vance seemed to falter, replaced by something he had long managed to conceal: panic. The reaction was instantaneous. Within minutes of the filing, hashtags exploded across platforms. Tars Crockett vs. Vance, truth over spin, mic drop lawsuit. Millions tuned into live streams replaying her remarks, dissecting her tone, her poise, her unflinching confidence. She didn't just clap back, she filed back, one viral post declared. Another compared it to watching David drop his slingshot and bring out a sword. Supporters erupted in cheers outside the courthouse, waving signs and chanting her name. For many, this wasn't just about Crockett versus Vance. It was about someone finally standing up to what they saw as years of unchecked distortion in politics. "She's fighting for all of us," one supporter told a reporter, her voice trembling with emotion. Meanwhile, in newsrooms across the country, anchors leaned forward in disbelief. Some marveled at the boldness of it, calling it the most daring political move of the year. Others wondered aloud what it might mean for Vance's rising profile as Trump's heir apparent. Could this lawsuit derail his momentum? Could it peel away the carefully crafted veneer of inevitability he had built around himself? For Crockett, the filing was not a gamble, it was a statement. She had spent her career fighting in courtrooms, standing toe-to-toe with systemic injustice. This was not new terrain for her. It was home turf. Where Vance wielded rhetoric, she wielded law. Where he leaned on spectacle, she leaned on evidence. The lawsuit was the ultimate reversal, turning his political theater into a legal battleground where performance meant nothing without proof. And in that moment, Crockett owned the stage. She didn't need to raise her voice or trade insults. Her weapon was precision, and her calm in the face of the storm was its own kind of dominance. The composure she displayed wasn't just poise, it was a signal to her supporters, to her critics, and to the entire nation. She wasn't afraid. The fallout began immediately. MAGA influencers scrambled to defend Vance, but their soundbites rang hollow against the weight of Crockett's documentation. Late-night comedians lampooned the senator's sudden silence, joking that J.D. now stood for just defeated. Editorial boards weighed in, some praising Crockett's courage, others wringing their hands over the precedent of legal action between political figures. Yet the most telling reactions came from ordinary people. Across social feeds, Americans who rarely engaged with politics found themselves riveted. Teachers shared clips with captions about truth in the classroom. Veterans reposted her words with comments about honor and accountability. Even small business owners chimed in, saying they recognized in Crockett a kind of grit they respected. And through it all, Crockett remained steady. She didn't gloat, didn't overplay her hand. Her public statements were measured, focused on principles rather than personal attacks. It was the composure of someone who knew the fight wasn't over, but who also knew she had shifted the terrain beneath her opponent's feet. The lawsuit was more than legal, it was symbolic. It was a reminder that rhetoric has limits, that even in a political era defined by distortion, there were lines that could not be crossed without consequence. For Vance, it was a nightmare realized. For Crockett, it was vindication. For America, it was a moment of reckoning. As the dust settled from that initial filing, one truth became clear. This was no longer just a clash between two figures. It had become a national event, a prism through which questions of truth, power, and accountability would be refracted. And for those watching from the sidelines, one thought echoed louder than all the hashtags and headlines combined. Something had shifted, but the aftermath would take on a life of its own. And the shockwaves were only beginning. The lawsuit detonated like a political earthquake, and the aftershocks rippled outward in every direction. Within hours, every major network had cut to breaking news banners, their anchors straining to keep up with the story's twists. Headlines screamed across screens. Freshman Congresswoman challenges MAGA Titan. Crockett versus Vance, the lawsuit that could reshape 2024. Truth takes the stand. Think pieces flooded the digital landscape. Columnists dissected the symbolism of Crockett's move, calling it everything from a watershed moment for American accountability to the most dangerous threat yet to MAGA's myth of invulnerability. On primetime debates, panelists squared off. One conservative strategist warned that this is a political assassination attempt in legal clothing, while a progressive commentator shot back, "No, this is what democracy looks like when truth fights back." Viewers leaned in, hungry for every exchange, knowing instinctively that they were witnessing history unfold in real time. And then came the wildfire of social media. Hashtags trended at lightning speed. Crockett vs. Vance, Truth on Trial, mic drop moment. Memes poured in by the second. One viral clip looped Crockett's calm delivery on the courthouse steps, set to dramatic music, captioned, "When the receipts are this good." Another meme showed Vance photoshopped as a crumbling statue. The caption, "Built on lies, falling to truth." Even TikTok dances sprang up, choreographed to audio of Crockett's most quotable line, "Receipts don't lie." The effect was more than entertainment. It was galvanizing. For Democrats, the lawsuit became a rallying cry, an unexpected surge of morale in a season defined by uncertainty. Party organizers reported record spikes in small-dollar donations, with one grassroots group declaring, "Crockett just gave us a movement." Volunteers signed up in droves, inspired by her audacity and steadiness. For the first time in months, progressives felt not just defensive but empowered, energized by the idea that truth itself had gone on the offensive. For Republicans, the panic was palpable. Whispers spread through the Senate corridors. Was Vance vulnerable? Could this weaken his status as Trump's chosen heir? Donors, always pragmatic, began calling campaign managers for reassurance. "What if this sticks?" one reportedly asked. Meanwhile, MAGA influencers tried to spin the narrative as persecution, but their message cracked under the weight of viral mockery. Even independents, those elusive voters often tuned out of partisan battles, took notice. Pollsters found a sudden shift. More than half said the lawsuit raised serious questions about Vance's character, and so the shockwaves spread. Coffee shops buzzed with conversations. College campuses hosted impromptu forums. Church groups and neighborhood associations debated whether Crockett had drawn a line the nation desperately needed. It was no longer just about legal arguments. It was about the story America told itself. Was the country strong enough to hold its leaders accountable, or would power once again bend truth to its will? In living rooms across the nation, people who rarely followed politics sat transfixed by the story. One mother, scrolling her phone after putting her kids to bed, shared Crockett's speech with the caption, "Finally, someone fighting for us." A retired veteran reposted a meme of Vance fumbling on TV with the words, "This is what cowardice looks like." The lawsuit, in its shockwave, had turned apathy into engagement. The empowerment was contagious. Progressives who had felt exhausted by years of fighting disinformation suddenly saw a spark. It wasn't just that Vance was being challenged. It was that Crockett, a woman who embodied resilience and authenticity, had dared to do it with calm, undeniable force. It felt like the tide had shifted, like the truth had momentarily seized the microphone and refused to give it back. Yet beneath the cheers, the memes, the headlines, and the primetime debates, there lingered a deeper current. Something more profound than the viral spectacle was unfolding, something that would outlast the hashtags. This wasn't merely a political brawl or a moment of catharsis. It was a reckoning, an inflection point in America's long struggle between distortion and dignity. And it left the nation hanging on a single question. Yet beyond the memes and headlines lay a deeper lesson. Jasmine Crockett never let the lawsuit be framed as a personal grudge. To her, this was never about a freshman congresswoman daring to challenge a polished senator. It wasn't about ego or headlines or even her own political future. From the moment she stood before the cameras, she made one truth clear. This was about the soul of American politics. It was about whether truth could still matter in a nation so often drowned in distortion. "Don't make this about me," she told supporters, her voice firm but steady. "Make it about us, about our right to demand honesty, about our responsibility to each other as Americans." Those words reverberated beyond the courthouse steps. They pierced through cynicism, cutting against the grain of the endless partisan spin. Crockett was offering something rare in today's politics. Not just a fight, but a higher purpose. The deeper lesson was unmistakable. Vance represented what happens when ambition corrodes conviction, when a man trades his integrity for power and thinks no one will notice. Crockett represented the opposite. What happens when conviction fuels courage, when someone refuses to bow even to the heaviest pressure. In their collision, Americans saw more than two individuals. They saw a mirror held up to their country, forcing a choice between manipulation and authenticity, between arrogance and dignity, and in that contrast, an unexpected clarity emerged. Crockett's calm, her insistence on principle, reminded people that dignity is not weakness. It is strength. It is the quiet kind of strength that outshines the loudest arrogance. It is the belief that service to the people will always, eventually, defeat selfish ambition. She didn't scream to be heard. She didn't smear or distort. She simply stood firm, and in doing so, she reminded the nation that truth doesn't need theatrics. It only needs courage. For millions, the moment carried more than politics. It was personal. Immigrants saw in Crockett's stand a validation that their voices mattered, that their truth could not be erased by cynical narratives. Young people, so often told their generation was apathetic, saw a model of what conviction looked like in action. Even those weary of partisan battles felt pride that someone, somewhere, still believed America was worth defending with honesty. The lawsuit became more than a legal battle. It became a parable. It told Americans that the fight for truth is never easy, but it is always necessary. It reminded them that leaders are not defined by the titles they hold, but by the principles they refuse to abandon. Crockett's story illuminated a universal truth. When arrogance collides with dignity, dignity endures. When lies clash with integrity, integrity will outlast. And so the moral took shape, not as a lecture, but as a shared awakening. This was about more than Crockett versus Vance. It was about a test of whether democracy itself could still reward courage over cowardice. It was about whether Americans were willing to stand on the side of honesty, even when it demanded discomfort, even when it required sacrifice. The crescendo built not from Crockett's words alone, but from the reaction they sparked across the country. In every cheer, every meme, every hushed conversation about what it all meant, There was the faint but steady drumbeat of hope. Hope that America's future did not belong to cynicism, but to those who dared to believe in something higher. Hope that unity, dignity, and truth were not relics of another age, but weapons still sharp enough to cut through today's fog. And that's why this story doesn't end here. Crockett's lawsuit against J.D. Vance did more than rattle the news cycle. It shook MAGA at its very core. What began as a single act of courage by a freshman congresswoman became a moment that forced the nation to confront the contrast between truth and manipulation, between dignity and arrogance. The tremors spread far beyond one courtroom or one political battle. They reverberated in the conscience of America. Because at its heart, this story was never just about Crockett versus Vance. It was about the values we choose to honor as a people. It was about proving that justice does not bend to the loudest voice, and that dignity will always carry more weight than arrogance. No matter how polished the rhetoric or powerful the platform, Crockett stood her ground not to elevate herself, but to remind all of us that democracy only survives when ordinary people demand extraordinary honesty. That message is bigger than one lawsuit, one senator, or even one election cycle. It is a call to protect the soul of the nation itself. And now, that call extends to you. If you believe truth still matters, if you believe dignity should triumph over arrogance, if you believe service will always defeat selfish ambition, then don't let this story fade into the noise. Share it, talk about it, pass it on, subscribe to this channel. Be part of the movement. Keep the fire burning. Because in the end, the only way to ensure stories like Crockett's echo through history is to carry them forward ourselves. This is more than politics. It is a reminder of who we are and who we can still be.